So we're in this series for the new year called The Welcome Project. And this series is, if you have been with us for a little bit, you know we've just finished this edition out here, this foyer out in the front, that was called The Welcome Project, but that's the building phase of this bigger thing that we're engaged in as a church, becoming a church of people who welcome others into our lives and into our church and into the mission and vision that God has given to us. And so we're spending a few weeks the beginning of this year, while that space is brand new to us, just reminding ourselves of what kind of people we're gonna be. And so last week we kicked this off talking about being the kind of church that welcomes people into our lives. We saw how easy it is to get so busy with all the stuff that we have and the things we have to do and the people that we already know that we forget about that group of people that are just right out there, just on the edge of our circle, that are lonely, that are isolated, that need somebody to step towards them, to connect with them, and how we're gonna be the kind of people who welcome other people into our lives, particularly the people that we haven't met yet. And if you missed that last week, you can catch it on our website. So I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that. This week, I wanna talk with you about welcoming people into our church. So last week was about welcoming people into our lives. This week, I wanna talk to you about how we welcome people into our church. And I'm excited to have this conversation with you. So quick question as we begin this. Those of you here in the room, how many of you like to go to yard sales, flea markets, that kind of stuff, just like looking for a deal? All right. Good number of us like to do that. So I did a little reading online this week. Back in 1989, a guy was at a flea market in Adamstown, Pennsylvania, and he paid $4 for this ratty old picture that was in a frame that he really liked. And when he got home and he took the picture out of the frame, he found a rare copy of the Declaration of Independence, which in 1991 was auctioned off for $2.2 million. How'd you like to be the person who sold that for $4, right? 2007, at a family yard sale, they paid $3 for this plain white bowl. It looked old, so they kind of thought they might have something. And 6 years later, so they didn't really think they had something, but they just kind of thought they might have something. 6 years later, they had this old bowl. They paid $3 for it, a yard sale. They had that bowl appraised, found out that it was a bowl from an ancient Chinese dynasty, appraised for anywhere between $100,000 and $200,000. They decided, because of that, like $3, $100,000, they decided to put up for auction, and it went for $2.2 million. How'd you like to be the person who sold that bowl for $3? So back in 1993, Marie and I, we were young in our marriage. We were in school. We had one kid. We were poor as church mice. We lived in this house that it was the best we could afford, and it was fine, but there's some things we had to work around in that house. And one of the things we had to work around in that house had a one-car garage that had it was a drive-through garage. So it had a front garage door and a back garage door. I'd never seen this before, and I haven't seen it since, but you could raise both doors and drive from our front yard into our backyard, this little house. And neither of those doors fit very well. We were living in Kansas, and Kansas has real Midwestern winter, and there are things that I like to do in the garage, and it was cold in there, and so I was trying to figure out a way to kind of take the edge off of the cold in our garage. And so we started looking around, and I had a propane tank for my grill, and I had the idea to put a little heater on top of that propane tank, because there's plenty of ventilation in this garage, and so put a little heater on top of that propane tank. And so we started looking around and found these propane tank heaters, and everywhere I found one, it was $50. And at that point in our lives, it may as well have been $1 million. It was just way too much, and so we couldn't pay $50. And so there was this day that we were at the mall, and we were walking around the mall because it was wintertime and we wanted to walk, and it was free. Walking at the mall is free, and we didn't have any money. And so it was a dying mall, and there's this store in this dying mall that was kind of a yard sale. It was just like this garage sale where there's all kinds of stuff. Whoever owned that store, whatever they thought they could sell to somebody else, it was in there. And it was just this loosely organized deal. And so we were just kind of browsing around in there for fun one day. And I found one of those propane heaters that were $50 everywhere else. I found it and it was marked for $10. And I couldn't believe it. And so I actually went to the guy who was working at the store and I said, hey, is this really $10? And he said, yeah, it's $10. And I bought it. And I doubt the guy who sold me that $50 heater top for $10 has any regret over that. But that's the closest thing I've got to a Declaration of Independence from a yard sale story. So I thought I'd share it with you today. But those first two stories, they illustrate this point that if you don't know the value of what you've got, you can really miss out. Right? If you don't know the value of what you've got, you can really miss out. And it's true about stuff, but it's not true just about stuff. If you don't know the value of the things that are in your life, then you could really miss out. If you assign the wrong value to your work and you just kind of treat it like it's just something that's not very precious and not very, you could end up losing your job. I mean, if you assign the wrong value, if you have the wrong value on your family relationships, you could really cause yourself and other people some problems. If you don't know the value of what you have, then you could really miss out. So we're talking this weekend about welcoming other people into our church. And as we have this conversation, part of what I want to talk about today is the value of the church. And when we talk about the value of the church, not so much from our perspective, although we're going to shake our head and say, yes, it's incredibly valuable, but I want to talk about the value of the church from God's perspective, about the value that God places on the church. And so I want to start with this statement for us: to be unchurched. So we're talking about the value of the church. To be unchurched, that's a person who does not go to church. Or to be de-churched, somebody who used to go but doesn't go anymore. So to be unchurched or de-churched is a tragedy. So you may think that's kind of an overstatement, or Daryl, you're just being dramatic. But I don't think it's an overstatement, and I don't think I'm being dramatic. I think from heaven's perspective, this is 100% true. To be unchurched or to be de-churched is a tragedy because of the value that God places on the church. And because of the value that being part of a church brings into a person's lives. So this conversation about welcoming people into our church is really a significant one. If you're looking at things from God's perspective and we're talking about the value of the church, value being part of a church, there's no in this. This is something that is significant, and this is a conversation I think that God is passionate about us having, because to be part of a church is a really big deal from God's perspective, and to not be part of it is a really big deal from God's perspective. So let's talk about God's perspective on the value of the church. So from God's perspective, the church is of infinite value. It's of infinite value. So when I was prepping for our time together and when I was thinking through this statement, I started with, from God's perspective, the church is priceless. It's so valuable to him that you can't really put a price tag on it. And that's 100% true, but it doesn't go far enough. From God's perspective, the church has infinite value. And in saying that, what we really mean is that the church's value is always at a maximum, and maximum never has an ending point. So trying to think of an illustration for that, I knew I'd have this water bottle up here with me. So just like that, this water bottle of infinite value, this water bottle would always be full to the very top, and this bottle never doesn't have an ending spot. It just continues to be the bottle full of water, and that continues to expand. And that's not a great illustration of all this either, because what's happening is you and I are finite and limited people, And so we're not really gonna be able to wrap our minds around the infinite value that God places on the church. It is maximum value that is always, at its maximum, always increasing, never finding an end point. And so we can't really wrap our brains around that, but like for a little bit, we could try. So we'll go swimming in the deep end of the pool here for just a minute. So from God's perspective, the church is of infinite value, and probably the main reason for that is because it's made up of people who are created in his image, and on top of that are being redeemed by his grace. So people who are part of the church, all of us are made in God's image. The world is full of people who are made in God's image. Every human being is made in the image of God. God made us like him in so many ways, and he made us with the capacity for relationship with him. And so each one of us is made in his image. And we don't fully understand what that is, but our capacity for relationship with one another, as well as our capacity for relationship with God, our desire to be part of things that are bigger than ourselves, like all that is a piece of being made in the image of God. And on top of that, for us as Christian people, we are being redeemed by God's grace. So we're all made in the image of God, but that image of God in us is defaced. You know, our first parents, Adam and Eve, when they ate that forbidden fruit, their rebellion against God, we inherited that, and our rebellion and our apathy against God, the image of God in us is defaced by that. And God looks at us, and in his great love for us, instead of pushing us away, in his great love for us, what he did is he moved towards us in Jesus, and Jesus paid for our rebellion, and he paid for our apathy when he died on the cross, and we're offered this forgiveness through his death and life through his resurrection from the dead. I mean, God moved towards us, and those of us who are receiving this forgiveness that God offers to us in Jesus, what's happening to us is we're being restored. We're being restored to who God created us to be. And so not only are we created in his image, but we are also redeemed by his grace. He's bringing us back into who he originally made us to be. So the Apostle Paul wrote these words in Ephesians chapter 2, speaking about this. He says, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. All of us, we were by nature deserving of wrath. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in our transgressions. And it's by grace you've been saved." So the church is of infinite value to God because it's made up of people who are created in his image, and even more, are being redeemed by his grace. So we are the people that he has his eye on, and he is paying particular attention to. And because we are created in his image and being redeemed by his grace, he places infinite value on the church. We see this value in the Bible by the images that the Bible uses to communicate to us what the church is, what the church is like. And so from God's perspective, the church has infinite value, and we can see this in the different images that the Bible uses to talk about us as a church. So the first one is the church is God's family. To me, it's just a really interesting image that God would use to talk about the church, it being his family. In Romans chapter 8, verse 15, the Apostle Paul writes these words. He says, "The Spirit you received." So when you receive the forgiveness that God is offering you through Jesus, God gives you more than forgiveness. He gives himself to you. He gives his Spirit to you. And so the Spirit that you received doesn't make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Because you and I we were slaves to sin, and we lived in fear of all the things, and the Spirit God gave to us does not make us slaves so that we live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. So you're a real member of God's family with an inheritance ahead of you, brought about the Spirit, your adoption to sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. That's the Hebrew statement, Abba, and then Father. So there's just intimacy there. And so when you think about your family, think about the value that you assign to your family. And we're at the end of the holiday season, so maybe again, this is a bad time to talk about it. But no, even in the worst moments of family, but in the grand scheme of things, you think about the value that you assign to your family. And if you and I, as broken and hurt and hurting people, and the harm we cause each other within our families, and we still assign that kind of value to our families, just think what a perfect God would look at his family, the value that he assigns to his family. It's an infinite value that he assigns to us. That God would call the church his family is an indicator to us of how much he values the church. One of the things that it's really encouraging to me as I think through how God has made himself known to us. You just kind of work your way through the Bible. God's made himself known to us. Several different images that he uses, titles he gives for himself. Of course, he's our creator. We know that. He's our creator. He talks about how he's our shepherd. He talks about how he's our healer, about how he's our God. But really the pinnacle of God's revelation of himself to us as people is that he would declare himself to be our Father. He's our Father, and he says of us that we get to be his sons and daughters, that we get to live in this reality of being part of God's family, and the value that he assigns to his family is, we can't wrap our brains around it. So there's this little verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17. It's a word of warning, but it communicates the depth of which God has feelings for our church. And so the statement is this: if anyone destroys God's temple, speaking about the church, if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. And this is a father making it clear to those who have bad intentions towards his family that he values this family and stands to protect it. And so this image of the church being God's family shares with us how much God values who we are. And another image that the church is, it's Jesus' body. Jesus' body. Like when Jesus was present on the earth, if you wanted to know what God was like, then you look at Jesus. The way he lived, what he said, the things he did, his priorities, his values. Like if you want to know what God's like, you could look at Jesus. And so Jesus dies on a cross, he rises again from the dead. It's just astounding. And then he ascended back to heaven, and he's building his church. And one of the images that the Bible gives for the church is Jesus' body. So if you want to know what Jesus is like, then look at the church. Look at the church. We're his eyes, and we're his ears, and we're his heart, and we're his hands, and we're his feet. If you want to know what Jesus is like, then look at the church. And there's this great little verse in Ephesians chapter 5 thinking about the church being Jesus' body. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church, for we're members of his body. Jesus cares for his body. You and I, we care for our physical bodies in temporal and finite ways because our bodies are temporal and they're finite. Jesus cares for his body, the church, in eternal and infinite ways. We're infinitely valuable to him. And so from heaven's perspective, this image of the church being body, shows us the value that God places on the church. And then this third image, and this is the last one I'm going to talk about in our time together today. This third image of the church is Jesus' bride. It's his bride. And I'm going to read some verses to you from Ephesians chapter 5. And usually when we read these verses, we're talking about marriage and we're talking about husbands and wives and how they relate to each other. But today we're going to read these verses to catch this image of how the church is Jesus' bride and the value he places on her. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. Jesus loves the church so much that he sacrificed himself for her so that she becomes who he's making her to be. Jesus demonstrates eternal and infinite care for the church so that she can become spiritually radiant and beautiful. And so from heaven's perspective, God, like the value that God places on the church it's infinite. It's infinite value that he places on the church. And so I want to say this again, to be unchurched or to be de-churched is a tragedy. To not be part of the church it's a tragedy. To live your life outside of the thing that is infinitely valuable and receives the eternal care of God, like it is a tragedy to miss out on all of that. For somebody to not be part of a church, there's so much that they're missing. There's so much that they're missing. So I grew up in church, and I didn't grow up in a perfect church. And if you go here, you know that I grew up in a church, and you also know that I have church baggage because I work it out on you sometimes. But I grew up in church and have been part of churches for almost my entire life. There were 2 times in my life where I was de-churched. Somebody who went to church and doesn't go anymore. So 2 times in my life, I was de-churched. First time was kind of early 20s when we discovered we had our Declaration of Independence moment with the heater for my garage. Ree and I were young, and we were busy with life and young family and school and all that stuff, and we just stopped going. We were spiritually lazy, and we just stopped going. And then we made this move to a new place, and we're from the South, and in the South, you have a church, even if you don't really go. If you meet somebody new, the question isn't, do you go to church? It's, where do you go to church? And so we went to this church, new church, and nobody cared whether we were there or not. And so we went to this church, and we did that for about 2 weeks, and then we just stopped. And for about 2 years, we were de-churched. And we were just doing life at that point. We were doing life. And in the day-to-day, we were getting by, and we were moving ahead, and we were just doing life. But looking back on that period of time when we were de-churched, that was the hardest time for us relationally. That was the most difficult season of our lives in so many different ways. So many different ways. In the moment, it looked like we were making it, but in reality, it was a tragedy. It was a tragedy for us. It was the least amount of purpose and meaning that we had experienced. It was a tragedy for us. The second time that I've been de-churched was actually as a pastor, and it was when I was leaving one church and getting ready to go to another church. And sometimes when you're a pastor, sometimes the best thing when you're leaving a place is just to go ahead and leave even before the next one starting. And so we had a couple of months window in there where we were done here and hadn't started here. And so there was this couple of months where we were going to a church, but we weren't part of it. And it was on us. It wasn't on the church. They were open, and it was a beautiful place. But we knew we were short-timers, and so it was just kind of in and out. And that was a really lonely time, too. And it was a difficult time just in so many different ways. But it was because we were not part of a church. We weren't part of a church. And so as we're talking about being part of a church, there's eternal and infinite benefit and value to being part of a church. And to be unchurched or to de-churched is a tragedy. And I think it's important for us to grab this perspective, not just for ourselves, but for our friends, for the people maybe who are just on the outside of our circle. To be unchurched or de-churched is just tragedy. So we're talking about being part of a church and the value of the church. I got to say this. Church is not just a place you go. It's a community you become part of, right? It's a movement that you join. It's not just a place you show up and do your time and then leave. Being part of a church means you come into a community and you join into the movement. Being part of the community, you get to experience rescue and transformation and peace and hope and victory in your lives if you'll join the community and you'll become part of the movement. And this is what makes baptism such a big deal. Just a tiny little rabbit trail with me into baptism, because when Jesus talks about being part of a church, when he gave the Great Commission to his church, baptism was a big part of that. And the reason baptism is a big part of this, for us, baptism in 21st century North America, for us, we have this private little moment where we put our trust in Jesus, and it's an important moment. I can't overstate the importance of that moment where you put your trust in Jesus. And then maybe at some point you get around to baptism. But that's not how it started, and that's not how it's been. It's not how it is in other places. When Jesus first looked at his first followers and says, hey, baptism is an important part of this deal, it was decades, maybe even centuries before anybody became part of a church that wasn't baptized. Because it wasn't, in those cultures and in places of the world today where it cost you to be a Christian, it's not that private internal moment where you put your trust in Jesus that has the price tag to it. It's the moment that you get into the baptism waters and you make the public declaration of faith in Jesus and belonging to this community. I belong to Jesus and these people that are with him. I'm coming into this community and I'm joining them on this mission. Like that coming into the church is not just I go there and I go home, but it is I'm in this community and I'm becoming a part of this movement. That means I'm with them and they're with me and we're together in all of this. And it's just this awesome thing that God looks at his people who are saying yes to him and saying yes to one another and yes to his mission. And there's just infinite value, from heaven's perspective, infinite value that he places on all of that. And so for us to hang on to this statement that church is not just a place you go, it's a community you become part of, and it's a mission that you join. It's hard to do that. It's hard to do that, right? I mean, you're here at church for your reasons, and it was hard to get here, wasn't it? It's hard to come into a church. It's hard. It's hard because you have an enemy of your soul who wants to throw up every barrier to God's goodness in your life. And so in a bunch of different ways, he makes it really hard for you. And it's hard because there's a piece of who you are that likes living on the outside, that likes the way it is now, that there's a piece of you that's drawn to this, but there's a piece of you that wants to stay outside of it for whatever reason. And so it's hard to come into a community and to be part of a movement. And it's hard because churches are made up of people. And you got to put up with stuff. If you're going to be part of a church, you get church baggage sometimes from being part of a church. It's hard. It's hard to do that. And so here we are as people who are part of a church talking about welcoming people into our church. And let's just acknowledge it was hard for us, it's hard for us, and it's hard for them for a variety of reasons. And so with that in mind, that acknowledgement in mind, let me show you just one more thing real quickly before we finish our time together. So in Acts chapter 15, verse 19, these words were spoken by the first Christian people. The first Christian people were Jewish people, and so they lived Jewish lives. They lived Jewish religious customs and dietary laws and Jewish calendar. And then this good news about Jesus begins to spread outside of Jewish circles into the Gentile community. And the conversation is like, hey, if they're gonna be part of us and we're gonna be part of them, do they have to join us? Do they have to come get on our calendar and on our dietary restrictions and our religious observances? And so the first group of Christian people get together to have this conversation. And here's where they land. We should not make it difficult for the people who aren't part of this thing yet. We should not make it difficult for those who are turning to God. We should make it hard for them. It's already hard, right? It's already hard. So those of us who are on the inside, we don't make it harder for them. Our job is to make it easier for them so that they can come in and be part of this thing that God is doing and that he's got his blessing that he's assigned this infinite value to. We have this opportunity to be people who not make it hard, but we make it easy for people who are turning to God, because being unchurched or being dechurched is a tragedy. So last year, 2024, we had 400 plus people walk through the doors of our church for the first time. That's incredible. Those 400 plus people are turning to God. You don't walk through the doors of a church for the first time because you're turning to something else. Like that is a turning towards God. And so we get this incredible privilege to make it easy for people who are turning to God, because being unchurched, dechurched is a tragedy for them. So I want to wrap this time up. Last week I gave you some practical stuff on how to use that new space. Today I want to just give you some questions for reflection. You should think through, maybe later today, maybe into this week, just to kind of process what we've talked about. So the first question for reflection is, which of those images of the church is the most meaningful to you? Be God's family or Jesus's bride or Jesus's body, which of those is most meaningful to you, and why would that be? Second question, just do you agree, and why or why not, do you agree that for somebody to be unchurched or dechurched is a tragedy? Are you with me in that? Like, are we together on that? You don't have to agree with me. So do you agree? And if you do, why? And if you don't, why not? This next question is, what makes or would make you feel like part of the church? I don't want to assume that because you're here, because you're listening to me, that you feel part of this. I want you to feel part of it. But the question really is a question for you to reflect on of what is it that makes you feel part of it? Or if you don't feel part of it, what would make you feel part of that? And then this next question is, what are the barriers that you did or are encountering to reaching that sense of belonging? And then the final one is just kind of towards some solutions, things to be prayerful about, is what can you do to help remove these barriers for somebody else? Because you're on the inside, and I hope more and more you feel more and more part of it. And to be unchurched or dechurched is tragic, and we get the opportunity to make it easy for people who are turning to God. So what could you do to remove some of these barriers for somebody else? And so with those questions in front of you and hopefully at the front of your heart, could I pray for us? And then when I pray, I'm going to turn this service over to Ezra, and he's going to wrap us up. Will you bow your head and close your eyes with me, please? Heavenly Father, we thank you for your great love for us. While we were still sinners, Jesus died for us. We thank you for your forgiveness and for the life that you have given to us through him, and the beauty of being part of your family, to be your children. You said you're our Father. And that, I know, stirs up a lot for a lot of us, but you are our good and perfect Father, and you always give good things and you do good things. Can't always wrap our brains around that, but we just say yes to it. And so as we lean into being a church that welcomes others into this church, we ask for your perspective, for your help, for your guidance in all these things. And Jesus, as we take time to reflect, would your Spirit lead us into your answers for us. So we love you, and we're really grateful. We pray these things in your name. Amen.